Sefer Yehoshua is a really great book to study because we know the beginning and the end very well. And even though there are elements of the middle that maybe are not so familiar to us, it's a more comfortable story to analyze because it's not so foreign to us. The basics of it we know, and the basics of Yeshua's personality we know very well, which also help us better understand the richness with which Sefer Yehoshua was written. My working assumption for these 4 weeks is that either everybody knows the whole story already, and if you don't know the whole story already, you have 4 weeks to read it. Now, if you 4 weeks is a lot of time. I read all of Sefer Yehoshua last Friday night just to get ready for this. My kids went to sleep. I was not asleep, miracle. And I opened it and I read it. 24 chapters, you could read the whole thing. You can read in Hebrew, and it doesn't take very long. A lot of people read much longer books on a given Friday night, and it's a very helpful technique. Sometimes when you study things, like when you learned Yehoshua in whatever grade you learned it, so you spend weeks and weeks and months on Perek Aleph and Perek Beis and Perek Gimel, and you never got to Perek Yutes or Perek Chaf Aleph. You certainly never got to Perek Chaf Dalet and gave it the attention that it deserves. Reading the book as a whole is very impactful, and I'm going to try and share some themes or impressions that I got from reading Yehoshua quickly, but breaking them down with you a little bit more slowly. So we will look at specific texts in Sefer Yehoshua because you have to read the book in order to discuss it. But I'm going to try and do more, study it more thematically than to study it chapter by chapter. And in all seriousness, if you're interested in reading through Sefer Yehoshua as we go over the course of the month, I think it'll be very helpful. If you have it in Hebrew, English, doesn't matter. Whatever language is most comfortable for you, there's a lot to be gained from just reading the story from beginning to end. We know a tremendous amount about Yehoshua relative to most other figures in the Chumash. So just a starting point, if you just came to shul on Shabbos and heard the rabbi every once in a while on Shabbos morning talk about Yehoshua instead of Moshe, or his role in the war with Amalek, or his appointment as the successor to Moshe Rabbeinu at the end of Sefer Bamidbar, or the things that are said to him and about him at the end of Sefer Devarim, you already know, like, more or less who Yehoshua is, and you understand the basic mission that he is charged with in his leadership. So he picks up where Moshe Rabbeinu leaves off, and he takes the Jewish people across the Jordan into the land of Israel, and he settles the land and divides the land among the tribes. That's his job, and he is incredibly successful. I always like to say Yehoshua gets more pep talks than anyone else in Jewish history. Don't worry, I know you're nervous, you're going to be okay. Chazak ve'amatz. Probably needed less pep talk than anyone else in Jewish history. Had big shoes to fill in those of Moshe Rabbeinu. We'll talk about that next week, but fundamentally has an incredibly successful career. We will try and take some time to talk about the one bump in the road in Sefer Yehoshua, and it is so minuscule compared to the major turbulence of Moshe's time as the leader of the Jewish people. It doesn't even come close. So in terms of measuring his success, he's a tremendously successful leader with a very interesting life and a very important role in Jewish history, underrated role in Jewish history, and we'll try and bring that to the fore tonight. So by way of introduction, I want to share the following idea, and then we'll work through it and try and add some context to explain it to the best of our ability, and that's source number 1 in the handout. Okay. There should be more handouts going around if anyone needs them. Okay, this is the Gemara in Nedarim. The Gemara in Nedarim, Adaf Chaf Beis Amud Beis, has a very interesting series of statements about the danger of having a hot temper, an angry personality, kas. People who get angry very quickly, care about their own feelings more than they do about Hashem. And I quote a pasuk, Rav Yirmiyah Mitifti Amar in the second line, Mishakach Tamudo, most of Tipshas. Person thinks they're so smart, but they get angry all the time, so they forget the things that they learned, or they override the things they learned. They don't put them into practice. Quotes a few psukim as well. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak Omer, if you see someone that has a very hot temper, you can know for sure just by assessing their temperament that they have committed more averos than they have done mitzvos. They have more avonos than they have zechuyos, which is amazing. And then Amar Rev Ada Bar Berebi Chanina, on the same kind of spirit in this context, Ilmale lo chatu Yisrael, had the Jewish people not sinned, lo nitan lahem ela chamishe chumshe Torah v'sefer Yehoshua bilvad. If things had been simpler, and they'd just gone into Eretz Yisrael and done everything Yehoshua had told them, and lived good lives, so then all we would have today are the 5 books of Moses and the 1 book of Joshua, Sha'archa shel Eretz Yisrael. He, as Rashi says on this Gemara, that Archa shel Eretz Yisrael means it gives us, it divides up for us where each Shevet went in Eretz Yisrael, and that's all you need. And what's the basis for that? This suggestion, Hibarov Chachma Rav Kaas. That's why it's connected to this Gemara. Our great amounts of wisdom come about from great amounts of anger. It's an interesting play on the pasuk. In other words, because there's a lot of kas, anger leads to sinning. Sinning leads to all of the peaks and valleys of Jewish history. Had we not been people with bad tempers, had we not been angry, had we not been flawed in our characters, so then things would have been a lot easier. There wouldn't have been this whole story. Now, it's kind of an amazing statement. We know you're familiar with the different traditions from the Chachamim about, the Chachamim didn't like Shir Hashirim, or they didn't like this book, or they didn't want to include that book in the Tanakh. Here the Gemara makes a very broad sweeping statement. Had we not had all the ups and downs, had the people never sinned, so then what would have been? Chumash, Yehoshua, and that's the whole Testament. Nothing more than that. So what's the question on this Gemara? I mean, many questions. What question comes to mind for you? Okay, so can we have a Chumash without Sefer Yehoshua? It feels like, obviously, that's why we're here tonight. Without Sefer Yehoshua, you can't tell the story of Jewish history. The question is made stronger by the fact that, is Sefer Yehoshua enough? I understand some very sad things happen after Sefer Yehoshua, and we have to talk about them. What about the other good things that happened after Sefer Yehoshua? What about the Beis HaMikdash? What? David HaMelech. So if the Jewish people had never sinned, we would have, maybe we never would have had kings. That's an interesting discussion for Sefer Shmuel. Maybe we never would have had a king. Okay, but we wouldn't have had a Beis HaMikdash? So what? The Mishkan would have stayed in Shiloh and there never would have been a Beis HaMikdash? It would have been temporary housing for the rest of Jewish history? What does that even mean? Okay, so it's challenging on both ends, but it is instructive. And I think by the end of tonight's shir, I think what the Gemara means will be obvious. And at least in my opinion, I think it'll be obvious. And this is my first impression from reading Sefer Yehoshua. Okay, so what are Yehoshua's responsibilities? What's his job? Conquer the land of Israel. Okay, great. What other responsibilities does Yehoshua have? What's that? Okay. Milchama and dividing the land. Whose job is it really to divide the land? We're going to talk about him later on. Probably the Kohen Gadol's job. Yehoshua facilitates the process, but he's not really the arbiter of who lives where, which is important. Remember, we're going to come back to this. Yehoshua comes from what Shevet? He comes from Ephraim, so he's a descendant of Yosef, right? If you're thinking in those terms. Okay, those are his jobs, and then there's some other responsibilities along the way. But what we'll see is that there's a common theme in the way that Yehoshua talks to the people that puts all of these responsibilities really into one bucket. So I don't have the Tanakh open on the screen. If you're watching on Zoom, you'll have to just hear the announcements and grab a Tanakh off your own shelf. But let's start with Perek Aleph, and let's jump right into Reuben, Gad, Chatzi, Menashe. We're in Perek Aleph, Pasuk. We'll look at Pasuk Yud Beis. So remember that Reuven, the tribe of Reuven, the tribe of Gad, and half of the tribe of Menashe come up with this idea that they don't want to live in the land of Israel. They want to live on the far side of the river. And they come to Moshe with this suggestion. the most offensive suggestion Moshe got in his entire career. We have no interest in Israel. We'll just stay right here. This is perfectly fine for us. So Moshe, despite, I would say, his instinct to reject their request, Moshe says, fine, on one condition. You have to come fight the war. You can only have the land once the war is won. So right off the bat, at the very beginning of this story in Perek Aleph, they prepare themselves to enter the land of Israel. Who's Yehoshua's essentially his first conversation is with the people of Reuven, Gad, and Chatzi Menashe. That's Perek Aleph Pasuk Yud Beis. V'la Reuveni v'la Gadi v'la Chatzi Shevet HaMenashe Amar Yehoshua Lemor Zachores Hadavar Asher Tziva Eschem Moshe Eved Hashem Lemor. Remember what Moshe Eved Hashem commanded you. Hashem Elokeichem v'niach lachem v'nachsan lachem es haaretz hazos nishechem tapchem ignichem yeshvu b'aretz asher nasan lachem. Moshe Be'er HaYarden. You can leave your families here where they are. V'atem tavru chamushim lifnei acheichem kol kiburei hachayil v'azartem osam. You have to join the war and you have to fight alongside the soldiers. Ad asher niach Hashem la'acheichem kachem v'yarshu gam heima es haaretz asher Hashem Elokeichem nosein lahem. You have to stay with them until they have land, just like you have land, because their land has already been won in the wars that were fought with Moshe. Vishavtem leretz Yerushaschem v'yirishtem osa, and you can return to the land that you have been given by God on the far side of the Jordan. Asher nasan lachem Moshe Eved Hashem Be'er HaYarden. That's the deal. Vayanu es Yehoshua Lemor. This is Pasuk Tez Zayin, and they said, Kol asher tzivisanu na'aseh. You have a deal, which is funny because they already made this deal a long time ago. V'es kol asher tishlachenu nelech. Wherever you send us, we'll go. Kechol asher shamanu el Moshe ke nishma elecha. Whatever, when Moshe told us things, we listened to him. So whatever you tell us, we'll listen to you. Raki Hashem elokecha imach kasher haya im Moshe. As long as God is with us under your leadership, just like God was with us during Moshe's leadership, we'll do it. And then they emphasize even further. That's why I said this is a very accessible sefer. It's very readable. Kol asher yamre espicha v'lo yishmas tevarecha l'chol asher titzavanu. You must rak chazak ve'amas. Anybody who disagrees, who disobeys with this, should die. Why is that unnecessarily harsh? Because it feels harsh, but there's a bigger reason. What are the terms? What are the terms of the agreement that were made between Reuven, Gad, Chatzi, Menashe, and Moshe?
That they would have that they would fight all the wars
if you want to inherit the land. And if you decide you don't want to fight, you die. There is. Remember, this a side topic. It's not really our focus tonight, but we have a rule in halacha. It's called a t'nai kaful, a double stipulation. If you want something to be legal, stipulation in a contract to be binding in halacha, it has to articulate, who's the lawyer in the room that can tell me the right expression, both the positive and the negative. What's that?
In other words, full disclosure.
A meeting of the minds. A meeting of the minds. It has to say both the positive and the negative. If you come to war with us and we fight the war and you stay until the end of the war, the land belongs to you. And if you don't come to war and you don't stay with us till the end of the war, you don't get the land. That's exactly what was said, and we learn it. The entire principle of T'nai Kafel is learned from Reuven, Gad, Chatzi, Menashe, and the stipulation that Moshe made with them. Okay? Stipulation is very clear. And anybody who doesn't participate doesn't get land on Ever HaYarden. If you don't want to fight with the Jewish people, you have to live with the Jewish people. That was the terms, but they go so much farther. And they say anybody who doesn't participate will die, which itself, I think, is kind of remarkable. Okay, then turn your attention. That's kind of our introduction to Yehoshua engaging with the people. Now, we're not going to go in great detail in Perek Beis, at least not tonight, to story number 2. You get to Perek Beis, and Yehoshua sends spies into the land. I love this chapter because it was the Haftorah for my bar mitzvah. Yeah. It was. The Parsha Shlach, anybody for the June bar mitzvah season. That's Perek Beis of Yehoshua. Why do we read it on Parsha Shlach, everybody? Because the Meraglim story is the Parsha, and then the second version of the Meraglim story is here. The Meraglim in the Chumash, are they referred to as Meraglim? Where do we get the term from? They're not really Meraglim. These are Meraglim. Okay, there's different terms in both places. Why is it a huge mistake for Yehoshua to send Miraglim? He is a first-hand account of how badly it went the first time. It ruined the entire previous generation. Chapter 2 says, I have a great idea. Let's send spies in the land first. If I was a leader of Jewish people, it's a good thing I was not, I would say, let's not do this again. By Yishlach Yehoshua ben Nun. It's a whole big, was it Moshe's idea to send the spies? Was it Hashem's idea to send the spies? Was it the people's idea? And then they forced Moshe to do it. By Yishlach Yehoshua ben Nun Menashikim Shnayim Anashim. Now, how many spies were successful in the first round? 2. How many spies does Yehoshua send this time? Only 2. Okay, so maybe he's figured out the secret sauce of how to spy the land. That's possible. That's definitely possible. But he sends 2 spies. And then they come to Rachav's house, but the people are onto them. So they have to go into hiding, and she hides them, which is an amazing story. And she's an important figure in this story as well. Fast forward to Pasuk Yud Beis and forward. Rachav, okay, this is chapter 2, verse 12, okay? Rachav has this whole conversation. She turns out to be a very knowledgeable woman about politics, so she knows the whole story of Yetzias Mitzrayim and how they got out and how Hashem has chosen them. And then she says, Ve'ata, this is the lecture that she gives to the Meraglim. Hishavu nali b'Hashem, yasisi imachem chased. God should recognize by my, I swear by my oath that I have done a chesed by you. I've hidden you from the powers that be and spared your lives. Va'asisem gamatem im beis avi chesed unisatem li os emes. So now I expect a chesed in return and a sign that you'll actually do it. You have to save my father and my mother and my brothers and my sisters and their families. Because they're gonna conquer Yericho and they're gonna kill all of its inhabitants. So you have to promise to save my family. We give our lives to this oath. If we don't fulfill this oath, we should die. Exactly what she asked for. Chesed ve'emet reminds us of Abraham and chesed shel emes, right?
Eliezer.
Chesed ve'emes in his conversation with Besuel's family and looking for a wife for Yitzchak. It means, in this context, it means do us a favor, but also give us a sign that we know you'll do it. In Rav Hirsch's comments I've shared in the past, he says, chesed are pledges that you make to people when you negotiate with them. Yeah, I'll give you this if you give me this. And then you're flexible because you're being generous in the negotiation. But what happens when push comes to shove? You deliver on the promise. So the chesed is the flexible negotiations, and the emes is actually sticking to your word. Which is a very interesting suggestions for those who are involved in business negotiations. That's the chesed shel emes is with people who can no longer negotiate with you. It's easy to renege, right? Okay. And the same kind of feeling here, the same kind of feeling. She says, please make me a promise, do me a favor. They say, we'll do you a favor, and if we don't, we'll deserve to die. Same kind of thing. So that's I don't think so. I think there's something specific about Sefer Yehoshua that has this specific kind of energy to it, which is why I'm trying to make exactly that point. The big error, the big sin in Sefer Yehoshua is in chapter 7. Okay, Perek Zion. And we're going to look at it for just a moment as we survey our way through. After they conquer Yericho, they go to the city of Ai. And they have this arrangement that they're going to go to war and they're going to win. And Hashem tells them they're going to win the war as long as they don't take any spoils of war, which obviously they agree to in the terms of the war. But they go to war and they get, in the next battle, they get They get defeated very badly. They lose a lot of soldiers. And they're trying to do some soul searching to figure out if Hashem had promised us that we're going to go battle after battle, victory after victory, what went wrong? There has to be something wrong here. And they come to the realization that someone had broken the rule. Understanding was that no spoils of war were going to be taken, and someone must have taken something that they shouldn't have taken. And in Perek Zion, the Navi tells us that that person was Achan ben Carmi ben Zavdi ben Zerach Lamate Yehuda. He took something from the forbidden spoils, Vayicharaf Hashem bivnei Yisrael, and Hashem became angry with them for breaking those rules. If you turn to Pasuk Yud, Yehoshua has literally complete collapse here. This is chapter 7, verse 10. Vayomer Hashem al Yehoshua kum lach, lama ze ata nofel al panecha. Loosely translated as, why are you overreacting? You lost one battle. Now, it's bad. He's a leader. He should be sad, but he's shocked. Chata Yisrael. The reason you lost is because the Jewish people sinned. Vigam avru esprisi asher tzivisi osam. They violated the covenant. Vigam lakfu min hacherem. Vigam gavnu. Vigam kichashu. Vigam samu b'chleim. They took something they weren't supposed to take. They pocketed things that didn't belong to them. They stole and they brought it home. V'lo yuchlu b'nei Yisrael lakum lifnei oivehem. Oref yifnu lifnei oivehem. Ki hayu lacherem lo osef liosim achem. Im lo tashmidu es acherem b'kir b'chem. So he says the only way to solve this problem is to figure out who the criminal is, find the person who took the spoils of war, and that person will be put to death. And Yehoshua goes on this whole search through the camp to try and figure out. There's some divine intervention to help along this process. And at the end of the story, what do they do with Achan? They kill him in a very dramatic way. Pasuk Chafei Chavav 25-26. Vayomer Yehoshua me'achartanu yacharcha Hashem bayom hazeh vayorgemu oso kol Yisrael even. They stoned him to death. Vayisrafu oso ba'ish vayiskalu oso ba'avanim vayorkimu alav gal avanim gadol ad hayom hazeh. And they made a mound of stones, a permanent monument to this. It's named after this. So why is this such a big deal? First of all, it leads to their only serious loss during all the battles that Yehoshua fights. But if you just zoom out at it for a second, it's not exactly the biggest Aveira. Compare it to the sins throughout the rest of the Navi. Compare it to the sins of the Jewish people in the Midbar. What's worse? Building a golden calf and turning your back on Moses and worshiping other gods. I mean, these are horrible things. There are horrible things that take place in Sefer Shoftim. What happened here? Guys got sick.
People died as
I'm saying this is the great Aveira of Sefer Yehoshua. It tells you something about the book. Again, as you read it, it tells you that Sefer Yehoshua is really a remarkable Sefer. It's just like everything goes almost so smoothly as we work our way through. But the idea that there was an agreement made, that there was a bris, and that bris was violated, so it needs to be rectified, and there needs to be a monument to acknowledge that one person did not fulfill the terms. What happens in Sefer Yehoshua when there's an agreement and you violate that agreement? Death. There's a certain intensity to the story as well. So now, we're really flying our way through. You turn to Perek Chav Gimel, and the land has been conquered, and the land has basically been almost completely divided. And then Yehoshua is old. So remember, a couple of months ago, for those who were in the main sanctuary, on one Shabbos morning, I talked about the fact that the Torah tells us Abraham and Sarah were old. And then years later, remember? And then years later, Sarah's gone, and Abraham has another wife, and lots of other kids. Torah says Abraham Avinu was old. So I thought we knew that already. So by the way, Sefer Yehoshua does the exact same thing. Yeshua was old, and then chapters later, Yeshua was really old. Exactly the same thing. But he's at the end of his life, and he's trying to address the elders, and he's trying to address the next generation of the citizens. That's what he's doing in Perek Chav Gimel. And we're going to take a look at Pasuk, beginning with Pasuk Yud Daled. Okay, Paraklav Gimel 23:14. Paraklav Gimel Pasuk Yudalid. V'hinei anochi holech hayom b'derech kol haaretz. That's a euphemism for saying what's going to happen to everybody else happens to me. That's just the way of the world, right? I'm about to pass away. V'datem b'chol levavchem u'b'chol nafshechem. And you should know with all of your hearts and all of your souls. Ki lo nafal davar echad mikol advarim hatovim asher diber Hashem Elohechem aleichem. Nothing has fallen from any promise, all the good things that Hashem said about you. Hakol ba'u lachem lo nafal mimenu davar echad. It's very beautiful and very repetitive, I think intentionally so. Nothing has fallen by the wayside. Every single thing Hashem has promised you, Hashem has given you. V'hayak asher ba aleichem kol hadavar hatov asher diber Hashem aleichem Elohechem aleichem. And when this happens, that Hashem gives you everything He promised you that He would give, you can be sure if God gives you everything good that He promises you, so then you should take Him seriously when He says that if you break the rules, the same thing will happen. When you violate the covenant of Hashem your God, which He has commanded you, you'll worship other gods, you'll bow down to them. Hashem will kick you out of the land, the good land that He has given to you. What's the language that He's using here? Right, it's Kriya Shema, and this is most importantly, these are the words of Moshe Rabbeinu, more or less. Right? It feels like Moshe Rabbeinu, it's no surprise. Next week, we'll try and look carefully at where Yehoshua resembles his teacher and where he diverges from his teacher, which I think is an interesting exploration for us. But this is an example of the divergence. What's unique about this statement? And this we'll begin to kind of head in the right direction. What's different about this? What is it about this statement that Yehoshua makes that Moshe never could have made? Not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. Exactly. Well, Moshe leaves the Jewish people before all the promises are fulfilled, which is the tragedy of the Chumash. Yehoshua is sitting at a different time in Jewish leadership. We are in Eretz Yisrael. We have conquered everyone we're supposed to conquer. Is that exactly true? Not exactly true. We'll get to there. But there are still some people around that cause trouble and will continue to cause trouble. What could be bad? Again, it's in a relatively oversimplified chapter of Jewish history. Everything except for one blip on the screen has been perfectly successful. Hashem has done everything over the Jordan. Walls of Jericho have fallen. The wars were won. We did lotteries. Everybody more or less got a fair portion of the land of Israel. Everybody has a home. Everybody has a neighborhood. Everybody has a community. Everything we have food. We have water. We have resources. We have community. We have a mishkan. Everything we're supposed to have, we have. And you, the greatest generation, if you will, have received the fulfillment of every promise that Hashem has made to us on a national level. And therefore, you, of all generations, have a responsibility to fulfill your end of the bargain. After all, in Sefer Yehoshua, what happens if you don't fulfill your end of the bargain? It's catastrophe. So we finally settled Eretz Yisrael, and you have to live up to the task, and how could you not? Because things are so amazing. Perek Chav Daled, this, by the way, was Yehoshua's address to the Zikanim in chapter 23. In chapter 24, by Yasof Yehoshua's called Shiftei Yisrael Shechema, he gathers the people in Shechem, and we'll talk about the significance of Shechem in a second. And he addresses the entire people. So now he goes from speaking just to the elders to speaking to the nation as a whole. And if you look at Pasuk Tezvav Tezayin, he says the same kind of thing. Let's go back to Pasuk Yud Daled, okay? We're chapter 24, verse 14. Ve'ata yiruas Hashem ve'evduo so b'tamimu be'emes. Ve'yisiruas Elohim asher avdu avosechem be'evra hanar b'mitzrayim ve'evduas Hashem. No, don't worship the gods that your forefathers worshipped is very interesting pasuk for other reasons. That your forefathers worshipped the Aver Hanahar. That's like before this whole story began. Avram Avinu, ancient relatives, and on top of that, the gods that they worshipped in Egypt. And if you're not interested in Judaism, bacharu lachem hayom es mi ta'avodim. You want to pick another religion? Pick another religion. He says, you could choose whichever religion you want. I'm going to stick with Judaism. It's totally up to you. Just pick. Now remember, this is also, he's echoing Moshe Rabbeinu. He's an old person. He's at the end of his life. He's giving his final address. Moshe says, you could choose good or bad. I recommend choosing good. I recommend choosing life. This is all familiar to us from Devarim. He's more or less saying the same thing. And how do the people react? Pasuk Tesvav. Vayan ha'am vayomer, chalila lanu me'azov es Hashem. How, God forbid, that we would ever do anything like that. Lavod Elohim acherim. Why? Ki Hashem Elokeinu, hu hamaleh osanu v'asavosenu me'eretz Mitzrayim mibeis avadim. Hashem, our God, is the God that redeemed us and our forefathers from Mitzrayim mibeis avadim. What's historically inaccurate about that statement? He redeemed us. At the Pesach Seder, everyone has to imagine as if I was redeemed from Egypt. We know, with the exception of Yehoshua, Pinchas, Kalev, Elazar, there's nobody. There's a handful of people that survived from Egypt that were still around. There's really nobody left, right? Even, which is ironic, when Moshe says goodbye to the people, he talks to them as if they're the generation that left Egypt, but they're gone. They're all deceased, right? Now Yehoshua is talking to his generation as if they left Mitzrayim, and that's their parents. But that's what they say. No. The God who took us out of Mitzrayim and brought us here, and the God who showed us with his own eyes, to our own eyes, all these amazing miracles. He protected us on this long journey. Gam anachnu navod es Hashem, Ihu Elokeinu. How could we not? How could we not worship God? He's the God who did all of these things. And Yehoshua warns them again, don't make mistakes, Hashem will punish you, etc., etc., etc. And then you turn the page, if you're in Tanakh like me, to the end of the chapter. And to the end of the book, the end of Sefer Yehoshua. End of Parak Chaf Daled, Pasuk Chaf Tes. See, well, you're here for 35 minutes. We already finished Yehoshua. That's amazing. It's thrilling. Next week we'll do Shofar. After these final words, Vayamas Yehoshua ben Nun Eved Hashem ben Me'ava Eser Shanim. He dies at 110. Vayikberu oso b'gbul nachal oso b'timna serach asher bahar Ephraim mitzvon lahar Gosh. And he was buried. Vayavot Yisrael as Hashem kol yemei Yehoshua v'chol yemei hazakenim asher harichu yamim acharei Yehoshua. The Jewish people were obedient to God, not only during his lifetime, but even in the generation after the Zakenim that he addressed. As long as those Zakenim were around, everything was fine. But asher yadu is kol ma'aseh Hashem asher asa Yisrael. Anybody who really knew what happened, anybody who experienced this story the way they experienced it, obviously served Hashem in the right way. Pasuk Lamed Beis. Okay, last two psukim, 32, 33. V'yasatzmos Yosef, asher halu b'nei Yisrael mi Mitzrayim, kavru b'Shechem. The bones of Yosef that were taken with the Jewish people from Egypt were buried in Shechem, b'chalkas hasada asher kana Yaakov be'is b'nei Chamor avi Shechem b'meya kesita, in the land that Yaakov had purchased from Chamor, the father of Shechem, for meya kesita, that was the value. Vayu livnei Yosef l'nachala, and that was a portion of the land that belonged to Shevet, the Shvatim of Yosef. That's Pasuk Lamed Beis. The Elazar ben Aaron Mace. Hopefully, we'll have time to talk about Elazar HaKohen. Elazar HaKohen died as well. Vayikberu oso b'givas Pinchas beno asher nitan lo b'har Ephraim, and he was buried in the real estate of his son Pinchas, who laid his father to rest in the way that he deserved. Okay. This is the end of the Sefer. You obviously want to end on a high, on a biblical high. That means bakava diklavaya, I suppose. It's like a good Jewish humor. But in all seriousness, what's wrong with the end of this Sefer? Okay, succession is a great question. Well, it does tell you, it's like things were good for a while. Yeah, it's not going to last forever. And it does feel that way. Because eventually, like, they're not going to remember forever. We know that because we're the children of their children. So we know it's hard to remember. Why are we burying the bones of Yosef?
It was a promise. We swore.
It's so strange. This is how we end the story. So the Gemara says there are certain kinds of things that you can't do until after the land was conquered, until after the land was divided. Why should that be? You don't know exactly where the Shvatim of Ephraim and Manasseh are going to be, so it's kind of on hold until you're exactly sure. I mean, it sounds like from the story that we knew where Yosef was going anyway, right? He's going to go back to the land that Yaakov Avinu bought, the Mea Kesita, yeah.
Well, this is how integration ends. Joseph said, "Oh, forget you."
I think that's exactly right. It is a great bookend to the story, but it should strike us as very odd of all the things for the story to end. So it should end this way. Who gets credit? Who deserves credit for burying Yosef back in Eretz Yisrael the way he always wanted to be? Does anybody know what question I'm asking you?
Moshe.
We've heard 25 different Torah about this over the years. Now we just have to reconstruct them in the context of Joshua 24. Okay, if you look at the handout, those of you who are on Zoom actually have this one in front of you. We're going to look at source 4 and 5. Okay, the Gemara in Masechah Sota on Daf Tes Amud Beis, source 4. The Gemara says that sometimes when you do something good, so something good happens to you. And then one of the examples the Gemara gives is Miriam, that Moshe waited for her because she waited for him, right? Last week's Parsha. Find that one we remember. Yosef zacha likbor es aviv ve'ein be'echav gadol mimenu. In the second line, the Gemara says Yosef merited to bury his father, and there was nobody among his brothers that was better than him or more influential than him in the process. As the pasuk says, "Vayal Yosef likbor es aviv, vayal imo gam rachev gam parashim." Milan ugadol mi Yosef shlonis asik bo ela Moshe. So Yosef, why does Yaakov turn to Yosef to ask him to be buried in Eretz Yisrael? Because Yosef was the one who was the viceroy of Egypt. So if you wanted to get it done, you don't ask Reuben, Shimon, and Levi. You ask Yosef. He's in charge. And Yosef had this chus. He was the powerful force in Mitzrayim at the time. So Yaakov asked him to be responsible for his burial. And it wasn't easy for Yosef to negotiate with Paro on this issue, but he negotiated so that his father could have an Egyptian funeral, but a Jewish burial. And that's exactly what he got. And as a reward for that, who greater than Moshe Rabbeinu to be responsible for carrying Yosef out of Mitzrayim? He carried Yaakov out, Moshe will carry him. Moshe zacha ba'atzmos Yosef, ve'ein b'Yisrael gadol mimenu, vayikach Moshe es atzmos Yosef imo. Right? Remember the beautiful Rashi quoting from the Medrash that during Choshech, everybody's walking around this week's Parsha. How such great timing. The Jewish people are going around and they're trying to look for wealth, for money, for valuable items that they can take from the Egyptians because they deserve it. That's reparations for their slavery. Hashem promised Abraham centuries earlier, we're going to leave wealthy, so I guess we should take some time to make sure we leave as wealthy as possible during. And what's Moshe doing the entire time? Looking for the bones of Yosef. Everybody, and the impression that you get is that everybody else has kind of forgotten about the fact that we made this commitment to Yosef earlier, but as the leader of his generation, Moshe has not forgotten. So he uses his time wisely, and it's the schus that Yosef had earned by working so tirelessly to ensure his father got the burial that he deserved, that Moshe didn't forget about him, and Moshe gave him the dignified escort out of Mitzrayim that he deserved as well. So that's beautiful. But what's also true at the same time is that the Medrash in a number of places tells us that the person who deserves the credit for the burial of Yosef is not Moshe Rabbeinu, but
Yehoshua.
Yehoshua. So source number 5, the Medrash Rabbah in Parshas Vayeshev, Rav Yehuda bar Simon, Rav Chanan b'shem Rav Yochanan. This was the tradition of the Tanaim. Kol mishu maschil b'mitzvah ve'eno gomra. Someone who starts a mitzvah but doesn't finish it, koveres ishto v'esbanav, will lose his whole family. Oh, terrible. And we learn that from Yehuda. He started a mitzvah, but he didn't finish the mitzvah, etc. And then the Gemara says, the Medrash says in the 3rd line, Kol mi shemaschil b'mitzvah ve'eno gomra. If you start a mitzvah but you don't finish it, be'achar ba v'gomra, and somebody else finishes the job for you, he nikres al shemo shel sheni. We give the credit not to the person who started with a good idea, but the person who finished it. As the pasuk says in Yehoshua 24, V'es atzmos Yosef asher ha'alu b'nei Yisrael. The bones that the Jewish people took with them out of Egypt. We had a whole big deal back in Sefer Shemos about how much credit Moshe got. Nobody else was thinking about it. Only Moshe was remembering Yosef, so only Moshe deserves the credit. There's no credit here. The end of Sefer Yehoshua, it should say, and thanks to Moses, we have the bones here, so we're going to bury them. It doesn't say anything about him. It's the bones that Bnei Yisrael brought out. The Halo Moshe ha'alam v'ikach Moshe atzmos Yosef ela lefi shenigzar alav shelo yikanes la'aretz. It was decreed against him that he could not enter Israel. Ve'elu natflu bahem lefikach nikres al sheman. It's true that Moshe started the mitzvah, but he didn't finish the mitzvah. So in Yehoshua, he doesn't get the credit at all. I think itself is kind of pouring salt on an old wound to a certain extent for Moshe Rabbeinu. That's the reason, my opinion, that this has to be the last thing that Sefer Yehoshua tells us. What is the greatest flaw in the Chumash as a whole? The greatest flaw in the Chumash as a whole is that it doesn't end. The Chumash, we're so used to it because we Simchas Torah, we know exactly how the story ends. What's the best way to characterize the Chumash as one book, if you will? It's the 5 books of Moses. What happens in the Chumash the Chumash begins as this great universal story. In the beginning, there was nothing, and then God created a world, and then the world kind of decayed, so he selected a nation, and then there's the nation, they go into slavery, and they build an identity, and then what happens to the Chumash? The Chumash becomes, gradually, the story of Moshe and his generation, right? Hashem says to him in the Medrash, at least, right? Well, not in the Chumash itself, right? Let's get rid of these people, and let's just go on me and you. It becomes the story of Moshe Rabbeinu. So where should the story end? I mean, if it begins with the beginning, so then maybe it should have ended with the end of the universe, right? With the full redemption. But if it's not going to do that, if it's a national story, right? What Rashi says to me, why are you telling me the whole Bereshis? Just start with the first mitzvah, right? Also this week's Parsha. So what's the answer? No, you have to tell the story of the Jewish people. The Jewish people need to know where they come from, their connection to Eretz Yisrael. You know a great way to do that? You know what would have felt really great at the end on Simchas Torah? Is if we crossed the Jordan River and we returned to Israel exactly as was promised to us. Think about it. How much emphasis is there in the life of Avram Avinu on the Bris Bein Abasarim, on the covenant that was made? Oh, Mitzrayim is going to be terrible. You're going to be there for 400 years. You're going to come out rich, and then I'm going to bring you into the land of Israel, and everything's going to be great. And what's the Jewish version of that story? Oh, Mitzrayim was so terrible. Thank God we got out of there. But it doesn't tell, the story doesn't end. But that's what's so crazy. If you would study the whole Chumash, but you would never open a Navi, so you would never know. This past year on Sukkot, for those who were here for Yantif, so we talked a tremendous amount about the significance of Yericho and the holiday of Sukkot. You can't begin to celebrate the holiday of Sukkot unless You're in the land of Israel. It doesn't make sense to celebrate. Think about it, right? You're going to celebrate the holiday of Sukkot, which says, once upon a time, we used to live in booths. They were still living in booths at the end of the Chumash. If you don't get to Yericho and conquer a city and call Israel home, there's no lulavim and esrogim in the midbar. It doesn't make any sense. You have to get to Israel. Otherwise, the story is incomplete. At the Seder, there's Arba Lashono Shal Geula. Votzesi, Vitzalti, Vigalti, Vilakach. But then what? The Hevesi's not there, right? Because in the Chumash, we're not in Israel. So what inevitably happens is the story becomes zeroed in on the greatness of Moshe's leadership, and without Moshe Rabbeinu, the Chumash really can't keep going. The Chumash has to end. If you'll recall, we'll talk about this more next week. We'll talk about the authorship of the book. So the Gemara and Baba Basra has a whole big debate about who wrote the end of the Chumash, right? Very famous Gemara. Why? Because Moshe Rabbeinu's dead at the end of the Chumash. So who wrote it? So one possibility is he died and Yehoshua wrote it. The problem with that is the theological problem. It's unimaginable that what? That Moshe Rabbeinu didn't write every word of the book. It's his book. Moshe is the great prophet who has the greatest level of prophecy in Jewish history. So if Moshe didn't write it, it's just not part of the Chumash. What does that tell you? Again, we'll have to solve for the last 8 psukim, and I think that that's important. But without Moshe Rabbeinu, there is no Chumash. So what ends up happening? Because Moshe is not allowed into the land of Israel, the story of the Chumash cannot include the return to Israel. The two of them are connected to each other. I guess in one weird, theoretical, abstract kind of way of thinking about it, had Moshe Rabbeinu been able to enter the land of Israel, don't we imagine that there would have been another chapter? Right? Bamidbar wouldn't have ended with Bamidbar. It just doesn't make sense. But without him, it's over. So then Chazal debate, okay, Moshe's gone, he's passed away. Who's writing the fact that Moshe passed away? Maybe he wrote it in tears. It was a prophetic statement anyway, so he could see other things in the future. He could certainly write about his own demise, or Yehoshua. Think about it this way. The whole story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Why do we go down to Egypt in the first place? Everyone remember? Famine.
We were invited.
Famine, right? We go down to Mitzrayim precisely because Yosef is in Mitzrayim. Yosef brings the family down to Mitzrayim because he's in a position to do so. Where does the whole story of their family fall apart? Because Yosef and his brothers have a divide between them. If you ask me, it's a little bit more of a loaded statement than it necessarily needs to be, but it actually all begins in Shechem. That's when the family kind of falls apart because Dinah's raped and the brothers handle it the way that they handle it, which is not the way that Yaakov wants to handle it. There's this huge divide. Yosef's growing up in the house. He's the favorite child. The brothers aren't really talking to their father anymore because the family is basically disintegrated. And Yaakov says to Yosef, I have a great idea. Go talk to your brothers. And where are they? In Shechem, right? So Yosef, who is the person who is responsible for bringing the whole family together, he says to his brothers when they arrive in Mitzrayim, I'm not mad at you because it's all part of the plan. So part of the plan also includes that Yosef be brought back. Who is the redeemer of the Jewish people? Well, sure, Moshe is the redeemer of the Jewish people in Mitzrayim. And of course, it's true that Moshe is a great prophet. So without him, we can't have a Torah. I understand that. Who brings the Jewish people to Israel? Yehoshua, right? And who is Yehoshua? He's the great-grandson of Yosef, right? He comes from Ephraim. That's the job. He brings his great-grandfather's bones back into the land, and he brings Yosef back to Shechem, which is exactly where he left Israel from in the first place. And therefore, one could make the following observation. The problem with the Chumash is that the entire story of the Chumash can be summed up as unfulfilled promises. That's the story of the Chumash. There's all these things that Hashem said will happen that have not yet happened. Why are we being taken out of Mitzrayim? Because we're going to be brought to Eretz Yisrael. Isn't that the promise? That's the promise that was the original covenant itself. The Bris Bein Habasarim, the promise to Abraham was, you'll go down and eventually you'll make your way back. But when you finish reading the Chumash, well, Moshe, we got the Torah, we had an amazing prophet, we're free, we have man, we have slav, we have water in the desert, we could live here forever. That's not the story. The story hasn't ended yet. The only way that this story is actually going to end is if Yosef's family, if Yehoshua is able to bring the people full circle back to Eretz Yisrael, which is exactly where they started. And for that reason, I think that what's actually happening in this story is that Yehoshua sees himself, or we can certainly see it in reading the story. There's a very controversial suggestion of the Abarbanel that Sefer Yehoshua was not written by Yehoshua. We'll maybe talk about the authorship a little bit later. The working assumption of the Gemara, Chazal's assumption, is that more or less the book was written by Yehoshua himself. So whoever wrote it, whatever their point of emphasis was, it's clear that the entire story, to me, when you just read it beginning to end, is that the most important thing is the word that you give. The most important thing is the fulfilling of covenants. If you break a promise, death. There's nothing worse than that. Reuven, Gad, Chatzi, Menashe have a promise. If they don't fulfill their promise, anything bad that happened, we made a promise. Hashem promised us we'd be safe and victorious in war unless you take the spoils of war. So we know what the consequences are, and that's the message that Yehoshua gives that no leader before him was able to give earlier. Hashem has fulfilled with you every single promise he made. So how can you, if you want to choose a different religion, speak now or forever hold your promise. That's what he tells them. That's the response. And to him, it's so simple. Moshe's simple avodas Hashem in Sefer Torah, God is so special, prophecy is so great, Torah is so beautiful. How could you not want a beautiful spiritual life? Yehoshua says, Hashem has fulfilled every promise to you. Now you have to fulfill every promise that you made to him. And the story ends by saying that promise from the end of Sefer Bereshis, that promise was fulfilled too. That's why the Navi makes such a big deal about the fact that Yehoshua brings the people in and he circumcises them and he brings the Karban Pesach. Everything is coming to fruition in this story in a way that it hasn't happened yet. And for that reason, I think this is what's beneath the surface of the Gemara's comment. If nothing else had ever happened in Jewish history, if no one had ever made a mistake, if we had never gone to war, if we had never disobeyed Hashem, if we had never done Avodah Zarah, the story of Jewish history would be a lot shorter. It would begin with Bereshis and it would end with Yehoshua Chaf Dalet. I mean, imagine if there wasn't a Sefer Yehoshua. So then none of the promises that Hashem made to the Avos would ever have come true. Now, Yehoshua is very mindful. Just like all these promises are being fulfilled, so Hashem, if you want Avodah Zarah, he'll kick you out of the land, all of these possibilities about the future. But the guarantees that the Avos were given are all fulfilled by him. He is the prophet who fulfills all the promises of Jewish history. And I think that's the way the story is structured. I think that's the way the language of the story is used. This is the ethos of Yehoshua's generation. Rachav says to them, if you make me a promise, will you fulfill it? Absolutely. This is the kind of people, the integrity that they live with is a product of the promises that were fulfilled during their generation. So there's lots to be said about this story, about the way Yehoshua is different, but we have to remember that this story is almost like the sixth book of the 5 books of Moses, right? From a historical standpoint, it's impossible to have one without the other, which is why it's so interesting, not only from a theological standpoint, but from a historical standpoint, that the same Gemara that says Yehoshua wrote his own book also suggests that he wrote the last few psukim of the Chumash, because they go together. There is a seamless transition, not only from a chronological standpoint, but from a theological standpoint. It's really important that the Chumash comes to an end. So Yehoshua picks up exactly where Moshe left off, and he fulfills all the promises that Moshe himself is not able to fulfill. So with that in mind, I think it's interesting to consider why. I mean, we know why Moshe is not allowed into the land of Israel, but what makes Yehoshua the perfect person? Partially, I think, is being a descendant of Yosef, I think is an important piece of the story, but there are other elements that make him uniquely suited, and hopefully that's what we'll do next time. But just by looking at the Sefer as a whole, I think you get a sense of what the objectives are. And if you read it to yourself between this week and next week, I think you'll start to see those promises shine through a little bit more. Okay, we'll hold here. Any questions for tonight?